The scale of retail crime is costing businesses big and small about $1 billion a year, and that doesn't count the emotional cost. How some are using technology to fight back.
The problem of crime has definitely changed over the last decade that we've been operating in this space, and you are seeing it much more brazen and more violence and aggression involved as well. By using technology, you can actually reverse that out.
Jewellery smash and grabs in the dark and broad daylight, vape stores, apparel, liquor, petrol, dairies and devices. For the first time, One New Zealand, formerly Vodafone, is speaking out about the crime and aggression its in-store staff are experiencing weekly.
We're sort of down to the point where we're getting them a couple of times a week. And that might be them putting their hands on you. It might be somebody coming in with a knife and cutting through cables to steal a device. It could be anything within that spectrum. But we are seeing a massive escalation in that.
It got so bad in downtown Auckland, the company decided to close the store, and it's still paying the rent. You're a dad, yeah?
I am, yeah.
Would you put your kids in a job like this today?
Personally, I would, with questions.
Retailers like One are spending millions on deterrents, like fog cannons, panic buttons, bollards, and safe rooms out the back for staff. But it's clearly not enough. Technology offers some type of a solution. One line of defence to help staff prevent crime and, when it occurs, report it. This Auckland-based company Auror is behind a lot of it. Its reporting platform is being used by the Warehouse Group, Briscoe Group, Walmart in the United States and BP in the UK for petrol theft. Chief Executive Phil Thompson says technology like his can send the scale of crime businesses experiencing backwards. Phil, thank you so much for doing this and for having us into your office.
Of course,
Love to be here.
Thank you.
Let's start by explaining what Auror software is and does. Can you give me the sales pitch?
Yeah, essentially, if you think about any shoplifting, theft or fraud that occurs in a retail store, that retailer would report that into our software platform. A recent example, I actually saw this in my own supermarket. 2 people walked into the store, filled up their baskets full of meat, and went straight back out, abusing the customers and the staff members as they went. So what happens post that event is that that store manager would report what happened, who was involved, what products were taken into the Auror software platform, to then notify their head office, their other stores, and importantly also provide police with that information so they can act on that as well.
So it claims to be a crime prevention software and also a loss prevention service in a way,
Yeah.
but that person walked out with those products, so how does it achieve any of that?
Yeah, so first it's notifying that next store in the area within that chain. And then importantly, you start to make the connections between the repeat people. So these people that are generally stealing are doing it 5 times a day, targeting particular products, working in groups. So it's actually very organised. And so what it allows, if you start to capture this information, the retailer can actually build cases on who are these repeat people, these groups, and then work closer with police. It's actually not as opportunistic as most people think. 10% of offenders are actually doing 60% of the crime. So very organised, profit motivated, and it's massive impact on our retail community and actually it's on the wider community as well.
Yeah, I definitely do want to go into that and how you're seeing that change.
Yeah.
But just still specifically on the tech, what is the back end? It's obviously cameras, is it also facial recognition and license plate recognition?
No, it's not cameras at all. It's probably a common misconception. So we're the reporting layer. So what we're doing is modernising the way that retailers can provide that information to police. So rather than driving down to the police station to report that crime or ringing 111 and making that report, they're simply doing that in a more modern way. So capture that information online and then being able to provide that digitally to the police. So it's much more faster, efficient. And when it gets to the police, they've got all the information, all the evidence, all the witness statements in one go. So again, it saves police about 3 to 5 hours every incident that gets reported to them. So suddenly they can put that back into helping the community on more serious crime, but also then focusing on solving those crimes as well.
What is the scale of crime that your company is seeing? I've had executives from One New Zealand tell me that in a retail broad sense, there's incidents being reported, and that's only reported, not actually happening every 3 to 4 minutes. Is your data capturing similar stats?
Yeah, what we're seeing, if you look at New Zealand as one example, there's about $2 million every day being stolen from retail stores across the country. If you then look at that globally, it's over $150 billion a year. So it's a big problem, and like I said, less opportunistic than what people think it is. It's actually much more organised, and that's where it's going to actually fund more serious crimes, so gangs, guns and drugs. Starts at retail crime, but that's what it's going on to fund as well.
And is that where your tech's having to move?
I think it's always looking at how can police gather information from the community, and from retailers is one aspect of that, and we help with that modernisation process for that. But I think the problem of crime has definitely changed over the last decade that we've been operating in this space, and you are seeing it much more brazen and more violence and aggression involved as well. And that's the interesting thing, is so now it's about 1 in 5 events in retail stores involve some sort of violence or aggression as part of that incident. So it's being used partly as a tactic to get away with these crimes, but also it has a massive impact on the people working in the stores. If you can imagine who's actually in those stores, it's often someone that's their first time job. It might be the 16-year-old working on the checkout, or it could be the 60-year-old who's been doing this for 30 or 40 years. They're the ones on the front line that are actually being impacted by this, and emotionally and physically, it's quite confronting for them.
When you started this business, it was, 2012 when you were doing it on the side as a startup,
Yeah.
officially got into it in 2014. Crime has, I think we all can agree, has changed and evolved and worsened since then. Did you expect it to get to this point? Did you have that vision that crime was going that way in this country and your business would be set to benefit?
I think the thing that we saw early on that hasn't changed today is that what is changing now with us, I suppose, is the visibility piece. So 10 years ago, people weren't reporting this crime because it took too long. If they did report it, it was quite hard to actually go and investigate it. It was seen as an individual incident that often wasn't almost worth investigating and solving because it cost too much to do so versus what it was worth. So I think over the last 10 years, what we've been able to prove and show is actually how much crime is going on. I think the methods have changed, like I said, but it's also just providing that visibility, so both to the retailer themselves to help themselves, so they can use that information to change how they're resourcing, putting in different technologies, guard deployments, and then working with police. Now on the police side, they can start to see that bigger picture and actually understand who are those repeat groups. And those are the people that are often causing more harm right across the community as well.
How do you feel about that? It's a bit of a personal question, but this is a growing problem that you hold one of the solutions to.
Yeah.
It's not good, obviously, but it is good for you.
Well, I'm really proud of our mission, right? And I think the wider company feels that as well. We are building technology for good. We're creating a company that's really focused on keeping our community safe. And we're empowering both the retailers and police to do that. I think, growing up in New Zealand and now having young children, we want our communities and society to be a safe place. If you look at what's happening around the world, I actually think New Zealand is doing a better job than others. There's some major cities right across the world where retail theft is a city killer. You've got depreciation of retail and property assets. You've got stores closing down. If you go into a store, you can't even buy a product because it's behind plexiglass, and you've got to get assistance for that, right? So I think what we've been able to show is that if you can tackle the problem early enough, and I think that we've been a key part in helping with that here in New Zealand, you can have a different outcome. And we're now really focused on how do we then help other countries around the world to do the same thing. But there's lots more to do.
What is demand like for your products domestically because of this growing problem?
Domestically and globally, every retailer faces crime in their stores. We work with most of the major New Zealand retailers. In fact, we work with most of the major retailers now across the world.
Can you give me some
in our core
names?
Markets. I think, again, New Zealand, pretty much everyone we work with, and our most recent examples is probably BP UK have just joined us. And then Walmart in the US is one of our flagship customers. And again, the size and scale of the US market is a great opportunity for us to be able to take our tech, build it here locally, and then take it to the world.
These other countries like the US have been a bit faster to adopt AI and tech solutions as the sort of first line of defence in many ways, obviously in this instance in retail crime. How would you compare the pace of New Zealand's adoption?
Well, I think it's been great to start the company here first and foremost, and so we actually got the opportunity to build the technology, to learn. We didn't come from a background of retail or policing, all right? So we came at this from there's an interesting problem here. How do you learn as much as you can about that? And then how to use technology to try and solve that. So that's been a really cool thing to then, first and foremost, help our own country. And then when you go international, we started here, went into Australia, and then more recently into the US and the UK. And I think that there's a lot more that both retail and police can do with technology, but again, you've got to have the right safeguards in place. You've got to be thinking about it from that tech for good angle as well. But ultimately, technology is going to change how people do their jobs.
You were a lawyer first, weren't you?
Yeah, thankfully my background was in IP and privacy law, so part of the reason I started the company is we were looking at how do you do this in the right way, legally, morally, and actually what we found is that you end up enhancing the compliance of both retailers and police, because traditionally it's been paper forms, USB sticks, CDs to provide this information from one page to another. And so all we're doing is just modernising and digitising that. So suddenly, if you can imagine that you can provide that video footage after the fact with that witness statement and the report through an online evidence locker, it's actually a much safer process to do that. So retailers globally actually then end up having better privacy in place, and then their focus becomes on those top repeat people, and actually removes a lot of bias as well, because you're no longer looking for the person you think looks dodgy or that vehicle that looks dodgy. You're actually now looking at who are the people that have got evidence against them that have just entered my store.
Where do you store that data, and how do customers ensure that it's not shared with anybody else?
Yeah, so each customer has their own data set effectively, and they choose to share that with police, for instance, and that's stored in the Microsoft cloud. So we have that locally in each geography that we operate in, and it's sort of that typical technology software as a service provision as well.
You mentioned profiling just in your previous answer. How dystopian does this get? Do we start using facial recognition software on camera for police to preemptively arrest people? Is that where this goes? Is that where this ends if the problem keeps getting worse?
It actually goes the other way, I think, and we've seen that with things like fuel theft, where you can imagine a vehicle drives into a petrol forecourt. Traditionally in the past, you've got a store attendant who's looking out the window, at hundreds of vehicles a day and having to make a decision of, does that person get petrol based on what they look like, what vehicle they're driving, or their general feeling of them. By using technology, you can actually reverse that out and say, only the vehicles that have previously stolen petrol from me, I'm going to make sure that they pay before they take their next petrol instead. So it removes a whole lot of bias from the interaction, and we've seen that a lot, say in New Zealand for instance. The last 4 years, while drive-offs around the world have gone up by about 300%, in New Zealand it's gone up by less than 10%. So you're seeing a really big outcome on stopping that crime first and foremost. But then importantly, you're looking at customer complaints. So again, in the past, they would have been calling up a lot to say, why am I put on prepay? Why am I not getting petrol? Is it because of the way that I look? They dropped by 90% for one customer, because suddenly actually all their good customers were getting their petrol, great customer experience, and those that were trying to steal from them couldn't.
So technology, in your mind, is the best solution we've got here?
Yeah, I think all technology can be used for good or for bad, right? The important thing that we're focused on is how to use technology for good, and how do you utilise new things like AI to actually enhance the productivity of what people are doing, and making sure that they're not sticking their heads into spreadsheets all day looking for information. You can provide them the right answer to go and have a look at, and then go and investigate. And probably the key thing is that this is all it's doing is probably transferring that information to police, who are still running a full investigation to understand what's actually occurred. It's just making that much more efficient on both sides.
What's the cost? Obviously, the benefit is that you keep staff safe, you may not lose as many products to thieves, but how much does it cost to get that benefit?
Yeah, totally dependent on each retailer, based on the number of stores they've got, the size of their loss problem as well. So it depends on each retailer. But when you look at, again, the impact it has on them, like the time savings alone from not having to spend an hour making a report, it pays for itself.
Are there any retailers domestically, globally, that you haven't got yet that you think need your software, Phil?
Oh, I think every retailer needs our software, and our mission right now is to really focus on those international markets. I think about 80% of our revenue is now export revenue. So a great thing to start here in New Zealand. All of our R&D still occurs here, but we can actually then sell that to the rest of the world, and make sure that we keep reinvesting, I think, in R&D as well.
What is the percentage that you've seen in your revenue year on year for the past few years?
Great question. I think probably over the last 3 years, probably about 150%
increase year on year.
Yeah. So like we're really focused on growth, and we've We've had investment for that basis as well, and then really focused on how do we keep building up the right product for our customers. And we learn a lot from going into these new markets that we can then expand the product and then bring some of those really good ideas back to our New Zealand customers who also win from that too.
If you're seeing growth to that extent, does that mean you have no competition? Does nobody else in the world provide software like this?
No, there's definitely competition, and it comes in different forms. So a lot of retailers have traditionally built their own systems. You've got some legacy software players out there that do something a little bit similar. But the way that we're approaching it, from trying to bring the police and the retailers together, we think is quite unique globally. And then for us now, it's going, how do we make sure we enter those new markets as fast as possible to make sure that we can continue to grow into those markets.
It's kind of interesting. If you look around, we're in quite a tech San Francisco, Silicon Valley style office, but based here in Auckland. This is actually what crime fighting looks like these days, doesn't it? It's not people in SWAT suits anymore.
It's a mixture. I think tech helps people to do their jobs better, right? And so if you're a security guard, a store manager in a retail store, or you're a police officer, like you've got to start to, we I think even as a country need to figure out how we're utilising technology to make our people more efficient, more effective. And we're just one example, I think, of a company that's focused on the technology side that can do that. But we now have teams right across the world, so Melbourne, Denver and London as well.
We'll keep up the growth. So good to hear about it. Thank you so much for having us on, Phil. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Madison.
Thanks for watching Markets with Madison, the New Zealand Herald show for interested investors. If you want to stay up to date with financial markets, click the subscribe button below and you can watch our other episodes here. Stay up to date with all the business news and numbers as they land on nzherald.co.nz.